If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
This is The Edge.
The advantage it means.
They look, I just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Hi, this is Mark. Welcome. Today, the guy behind a huge television event that you've probably seen promoted if you've watched any primetime television, any sports. It was all over the World Series and NFL games. The show's called The Long Road Home, and it chronicles the events of 2004. It was a platoon in Sadr City, Baghdad, an American platoon ambushed by thousands of Iraqi insurgents. It was known as Black Sunday, and this entire thing will be brought to life by our guest, Mikko Alanne. He took the book written by Martha Raddatz and turned it into a miniseries for Nat Geo, and it premieres November 7th. And it is a hugely anticipated television event. So glad that we're going to get a chance to talk to him. That'll be the bulk of the show. We'll start with the Fast 15 with Michael Shure. We spoke to Michael before the news of Paul Manafort and the indictments broke. There'll be more indictments, and Manafort Gates, his associate, being indicted on money laundering charges is very, very serious, but not related to the Russian collusion part of this investigation, which was the original reason for the special prosecutors. You may say, well, I know these guys are rich and we're mobbed up with Ukrainians and Russians and we're hiding money in offshore accounts, but what does that have to do with the election? That may come out of the Manafort part of this investigation, but I think it's likely that the George Papadopoulos guilty plea, someone who was on the Trump campaign, George Papadopoulos, that is more likely to produce the fire associated with at least the intent to collude in some way or get information from the Russians. Look, there certainly was an intent to get dirt from the Russians on Hillary Clinton. That we know. But the Manafort indictment has to do with money. It has to do with money laundering. That's an extremely serious charge. As you know, $75 million in money laundering is what the indictment specifies. And we're learning more about Paul Manafort. And that, you might even say, is no surprise because we knew he was mobbed up with the Ukrainians. We knew he was mobbed up with the Russians. So all of this is, in a way, not surprising. Maybe it's surprising how dirty he is, or maybe it's surprising how he hid the money. But in any case, we'll follow the bouncing ball of Paul Manafort. And the last thing I would say about Manafort is he is incentivized to start talking. A $10 million bond. His passport has been revoked, and as it turns out, he has 3 passports, and he may go away for the rest of his life. So if ever there was a guy who was incentivized to start talking, it's Paul Manafort. Just saying, follow that bouncing ball as well. So follow Papadopoulos on the collusion right now. Follow Manafort on what may come as he begins talking. Thank you for supporting our show. Thank you for being here. Thank you for downloading the show. Thank you for buying through Amazon. The Amazon link on our website, when you go to an episode, it says buy Amazon, or it says Amazon somewhere. There's a link that says Amazon. Click on that link, and whatever you buy on Amazon, we get a small piece, and it helps keep the lights on here. Thanks again. Let's get started. Time for the Fast 15, politics, and more. He's our pal. He is Michael Shure, everybody.
Thank you so much. It's, as you know, great to be here.
Well, I always hope that it's great to be here. I know it's sometimes not the most convenient thing, but we appreciate it. Let's start with, just arbitrarily, with that Corker Flake thing.
Okay.
These are high-profile senators who came out vocally against the president, President Trump. And they had formerly supported President Trump.
Correct, to some degree. Flake really never supported him.
Corker was out there on the talk shows.
No. Corker did. Flake, I'm sure, voted for him. I'm not sure. I'm almost positive he did. And he supported a lot of his legislation. Flake, there are 2 differences here. One is Bob Corker could have cruised to re-election in Tennessee. There was no question about that. He's well liked by both Democrats and Republicans in Tennessee. Jeff Flake may not have even been the nominee for his own Senate seat. So there was a political element to it. However, that's where the skeptics can leave the room, because even if he said, I'm not running, he didn't have to go to the floor of the Senate and say why. The nature of what he said, I'd never seen before in my life. The fact that you had a senator criticizing specifically the president of the United States of his own party on the Senate floor was something I had never seen. And that, to me, is the headline there. And what they are is they're giving voice to something that they know exists not just in the minds of Bob Corker and Jeff Flake. And they're leaving the Senate, but they're not leaving tomorrow. They're leaving in a year and change. And they are going to be able to be the buffer zone for a lot of senators who can't say that yet, but are going to say it soon, I believe.
In the new Washington, and by that I mean there's this sort of bizarre Washington now where nothing seems to conform to any rules. Allegiances are not what they were. Allegiances to facts aren't what they were. Allegiances to party aren't what they were. Does that dilute the effects of what you've been talking about?
Well, it doesn't dilute it. There are going to be a number of Republicans and Trump people that are celebrating the departures of these people that are not on board with the drain the swamp, that are part of the quote-unquote swamp.
Trump's already saying that. He's saying, well, Jeff Flake wasn't going to win anyway. He's a loser.
Right, exactly. But it matters because he's a loser to Donald Trump, and he's a loser to a lot of the people that showed up to vote for Donald Trump. He's not a loser to the 98 other senators who are serving and the 50 other Republicans who are serving. So there's something to that makes it more important. Donald Trump appealed to enough Americans to win the presidency. Now his audience is 535 people. It's not everyone. He's not running for election right now. Those are the people that have to distill that take in Donald Trump and also translate that to their constituents, either as representatives or senators. It's a lot different.
Something else that happened in the Senate is they voted to kill, essentially, it's a rule that would allow Americans to file class action suits against banks.
Right.
Right now they're forced into arbitration.
Yeah.
And arbitration, of course, means that you're going to get very little money. There's a cap on it. It's also outside the judicial system. I mean, there's no real formal court case going on.
Right.
So from a consumer standpoint, it leaves you in a much worse place.
It does. And, it makes you think, is there a little tiny piece of paper folded in the inside pocket of Donald Trump's jacket that says things Obama did, and he just keeps going down the list. Well, this rule is a Consumer Financial Protection Board, which was created under Obama, headed initially by Elizabeth Warren. That is exactly what it says. And the rule is part of their creation. It's part of the constitution of the CFPB. And what it's designed to do is help people have recourse against these big banks in response to what happened in 2007, 2008. Well, if this is gone, and it was a tie broken by the Vice President, Mike Pence, if it's gone, it really leaves consumers in a lurch, and it allows the Wells Fargos and the big
Equifaxes.
Banks, the Equifaxes, which isn't really as considerable a conversation to most Americans what the Equifax, but it's when it's about suing the big banks, they know what that means, and it's an offense to those people.
When there's systematic overcharging of a bunch of people, and you realize, oh my God, it's just that. It's in the system that we're being overcharged thousands. The only recourse is generally a class action of some kind.
Right. And roll over and just let it happen is what and again, when you're voting for your senator, they're not talking about class action lawsuits on the trail in the middle of Oklahoma. Nobody's asking that. And the one person who's asking says, I'll take a look at that. That's what a candidate will say. But when you vote for a Republican candidate now, this is what you get because they are on the side of the banks, and that's perfectly clear. And it's not I don't mean it in a derogatory way. It's honestly what they are. I'm not criticizing them for it. I'm saying fact. Republicans protect the big banks. They have since 2008 and before, but most, appropriately to talk about since 2008. And that's what's happening now.
Meanwhile, over at the FCC, where there are all sorts of changes underway, I've talked before about the change that's coming to the Internet. Because net neutrality is, I don't want to get off on this too much, but net neutrality seems in danger. And net neutrality, I think, will likely go away. The neutral net, the way everything comes in, because of the policies and the disposition of the new head of the FCC under Trump. Now there's something else that's going to fall into that same category, that because, again, of the disposition of the commission, and that is the ownership provisions, the ownership rules that are now going to be relaxed to let one company own many more broadcast stations than it used to. And in the case of this particular company, Sinclair Broadcasting, they reflect a hard right position.
That's right.
And so you're going to see that hard right position played out in newscasts and editorials and these what they call must-run pieces of content on all their Sinclair stations. And now the Sinclair stations are going to be across America.
Yeah, and when the right is wealthier, that's what happens, because this is the money that the right has, really monopolizing the bullhorn. And that's what's happening here with the FCC. Again, you elect a president like Donald Trump, you're going to get these relaxed restrictions on this sort of thing because they want to spread a message that is conducive to what they are saying themselves, echoes what they're saying themselves. It's conducive to them doing politics in that way. It's pretty bad.
And we're talking about huge broadcast stations.
Right, but that's exactly right.
Los Angeles and Chicago and New
No,
York.
it is as close to monopoly as you get.
I already thought there was a monopoly because now if you go to all those places I just mentioned, there are 2 stations in those markets owned by one media company. Well, that does get in the way of a couple of things, competition and also different sorts of information.
And jobs, by the way. And
well, that's the
payroll,
monopoly part.
So they
that's the competition part.
I see what
you're saying. Competition from the standpoint of content. I was thinking of it also including jobs. You're absolutely right. Yeah, if you lose your job at Channel 11, you go, oh, it's okay, I'll go and get a job at Channel 13. No. Channel 13 is owned by Channel 11.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to hire you now.
No.
Yeah. And in the news business, that sounds odd because people say, well, you were with Channel 2. You can't just go to Channel. Well, if you're at a law firm and you want to leave a law firm, there are plenty of law firms you go to. If you work at a restaurant, you want to, wait table someplace else, you leave. So when people criticize people in news leaving a channel and going to another station, I mean, that's silly because it's just like any other business. You go where the work is.
And the idea that we're going to be spoon-fed this stuff, which is really reflective of either philosophy, right-wing or progressive, is just, it's wrong.
Yeah.
It makes me pray for the end of the broadcast industry even more.
I'm not praying for that now because.
Oh, you're on now.
Yeah. I'm kind of on, but I mean, I make it is how I make a living. So
okay. Well, then I'll hold that prayer.
Just hold the prayer.
If it's
thoughts and prayers.
If it's any consolation, prayers don't do anything.
Right. Hey, this is off the subject. The Miami Dolphins lost 40-0 last night.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Colin Kaepernick wouldn't have helped there, would he?
The guy who was the quarterback for the Dolphins, this guy Matt Moore, he was awful.
Right, and he's only a little more awful than their starter Jay Cutler, who was so awful that he couldn't make it in the NFL. He became a broadcaster until their quarterback Ryan Tannehill got hurt. So they brought him out of the booth from being an awful quarterback, even though someone who is wildly better in Colin Kaepernick is on the open market.
I'll get to Colin Kaepernick in a second, but back to Jay Cutler. I love that story. I love that narrative. The guy who had been beat up in Chicago as their quarterback, goes into the broadcast booth, as Michael says, and then is called back onto the field, right? He's been called every name in the Chicago media. He's washed up. He's done. In my movie, he takes them to the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, he only lasted...
Well, you also wouldn't have cast Jay Cutler in that role, right? If it were Tony Romo, who's done the same thing, has gone into the booth just now, and the Dolphins called Tony Romo out, started him, and he did well. Oh, my God, that's a movie I want to see.
Right. You want this scrappy guy who had done well but had never been to the dance,
Exactly.
And now he's too old, and so he's gone to the booth. You're right. It's not quite the Jay Cutler story, but I like the idea of a guy from
No, I know. Yeah.
It's what they did with those 3 old guys, Clint Eastwood, Tommy Lee Jones, whatever.
Donald Sutherland, they went into space.
Yeah, when they had to blow up
Space
the moon.
Cowboys.
Exactly.
No, I'm so happy because I never get a movie reference, and I got that one.
That was very impressive.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I got that Donald Sutherland was the other one, and I have to tell you, I never saw it. So that's even better.
I don't think anyone saw it.
Nobody saw that. But yeah, the story is great. You want to cast somebody more likable in the role.
Who are the 3 guys when they did a similar thing when they go to Las Vegas? Okay, it's Robert De Niro. It's just recently classic. Like, hey, we're going to get these 3 stars. They're old, and we're going to go to Vegas, have a great time, and we're going to make a movie.
I don't know.
Morgan Freeman, Robert De Niro, and a third.
Was this Going in Style?
Maybe it was.
No, because Going in Style was a remake of a George Burns, Art Carney, and someone else movie where they rob a bank.
Oh, yeah. Maybe that's what this is.
That might be this. They don't go to Vegas. I think they rob a bank. It was a remake of that movie.
No. They went to Las Vegas. It was called Last Vegas. It's Robert De Niro, Morgan Freeman, Kevin Kline, and Michael Douglas.
Wow. Okay.
That, to me, looks on its face like it's going to be awful. I mean, that they just put together this project, and it's just awful.
Look up Going in Style, too, because I think they remade Going in Style which was these old guys sitting around with nothing to do. Hey, let's rob a bank. Let's become bank robbers. And it was a really good movie that came out in the 70s.
You're absolutely right. Going in Style was just released. It's Morgan Freeman.
Again, that's why.
Morgan Freeman's in everything.
Yeah.
We need an older black man who white audiences will also like.
Right. And Robert Guillaume just died.
Yeah. So, boy, if you're Robert Guillaume, what a great career he's had. But he has to be going, really, Morgan Freeman again?
Yeah,
I mean,
know.
Can you guys not see me sitting over here?
Right.
I can sing. I can.
Yeah.
I mean, he did so well. He probably wasn't saying that, but if he were me, he would say it. Alan Arkin, Michael Caine, and Morgan Freeman.
Wow.
Going in Style.
Yeah. So, and that was a remake of the movie with George Burns, Art Carney, and there's another guy, and I don't know who it is, and that's what's killing me. The guys, they went on to do Cocoon, probably.
Yeah, Going in Style was a movie from 1979.
Right, that's the one. Art Carney, George
Lee
Burns.
Strasberg.
Oh, Lee Strasberg. And
Jeez.
that was before they had to put a black guy in it, I guess. Is that what happened? So Morgan Freeman was on the electric company still. They had no idea.
George Burns is the closest thing to a black guy that you've got there. Lee Strasberg, Art Carney, George Burns.
Lee Strasberg,
and Charles Hallahan as Pete.
So I guess that was the Kevin Kline. Oh, no, that was the fourth guy you mentioned before. It was Pete. Yeah, so I remember seeing that movie. It was a good movie.
But you never saw Space Cowboys.
Never saw Space Cowboys or never heard of Last Vegas.
Yeah, well, nobody saw Las Vegas. It was just awful. But
let's play a game, Mark.
All right.
Movies, just Las Vegas movies, quickly.
Casino.
Leaving Las Vegas.
The Rat Pack movie remade.
It's my turn.
They
it's
did
not,
3
it's
of
your
them.
turn. You got to come
Well, I'm
up
going to
with
be
it.
able to. You can say it one.
No, but it's not my turn yet. So you got
I
to say
see.
it in one. Yeah, no sequels. But you have to come up with another one if that's
Okay. Honeymoon in Vegas.
All right. Ocean's 11.
Ocean's 11.
I've got 2. One of which I can't believe you haven't used yet.
Well, one of which is Lost in America.
Okay, well then Last Vegas, because we haven't used it in the game.
And I still have one.
All right, I have one.
The Electric Horseman.
Oh, wow. Robert Redford and Jane Fonda went to Vegas in that movie?
He rode.
That's right.
He rode the horse into the casino.
Hard 8.
Oh, very good.
Thank you.
The Cooler.
Oh, the Cooler. Yeah. Was
That
that
was
that Vegas or was that? I
No,
saw
that was
the
Vegas.
Cooler. I liked
It was Alec Baldwin and what's his name?
I thought it was an English guy. I thought no.
No, it was. We had the same accountant for a while. What's his name?
The accountant I'll come up with first.
No. He was in lead in Fargo.
Yeah, William H. Macy.
William H. Macy, right?
All right, so you're winning right now, and I need a Vegas movie.
Oh, I love this. I don't win much of anything.
No,
ever.
and I think you're going to win this one because I don't see as many movies as. Vegas Vacation.
Oh, that's very good.
Thank you.
Very, very
Thank you.
good. At the warning track. I may be having to tap out here. Oh, wait a minute. Speaking of tapping out, is there no boxing movie in Las Vegas or something?
Oh, that's a great call to go that direction.
There's no fight movie? There must have been a fight movie in Las Vegas. Well, this isn't a movie about Las Vegas, but of course Rocky ended there.
I
don't think that counts, honestly. It doesn't.
I
If
don't
you
think
said it,
so.
I wouldn't
Yeah,
allow it.
No, okay. I have bad news for you.
You can think of one.
I can think of one.
A movie about Las Vegas? It can't just be. It's not boxing. It has to be.
Right. It's It's.
Oh my God, this is awful. Hang on, give me just 10 more seconds. Let me just see if I can think of.
You get the random 13 seconds in this game, by the way.
I give.
All right. Viva Las Vegas.
Oh,
How did we forget that?
Viva Las Vegas. Very strong.
A bright light city. I don't know. I know I took us in a direction we don't often go.
I like that we went there.
Okay, good. Because we'll get, I think, feedback from 1,000 movies that we'd forgotten that people will.
Yeah, I think so too. This isn't the version we wanted, though. This is ZZ Top.
Then 24 hours in the day.
This is Elvis and ZZ, right?
Yeah.
It's like a remix or something. Michael Shure, thank you for joining us.
No, it's great to be here. It's great to be here. Bet with your head, not over it.
Thanks, Michael!
I want to thank you for all the ways that you support my friends on The Edge. And if you haven't already, why don't you show your support and subscribe? What's the matter with you? Go to Edge Show. Oh, it's Edge Dash. What's with the dash? Stupid. All right, let me show your support and leave something on their website. Edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is there a dash? edge-show.com.
And now here's one of the promos for The Long Road Home.
All Comanche Red, keep your eyes open, over.
Guys, see what I'm seeing?
Friends, everyone. Hold position, over.
Ambush!
Comanche 6, Red 1, we are in new contact, over. I know you're upset, but we talked about this, right?
You've never been to war before.
2 vehicles down. I repeat, we need immediate evac, over.
Gentlemen, this is a highly prepared enemy who has coordinated a citywide attack.
A platoon's been attacked.
I am anxious. We are all so anxious.
I promise I'd get them back safe. Promised all of them.
I'm gonna need all of this to come back.
Everybody rebound! Bless them for their sacrifice.
Back up, back up, back up!
I just gotta go over there. I gotta go help some people.
Why?
Those guys in my platoon, they're my family too.
The Long Road Home, Tuesday, November 7th at 9 on National Geographic.
So excited to have Mikko Alanne with us, Laura. This is a great thing.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, Mikko is a writer. He's a producer. And you have a show coming that looks so good. And it's based on a book that was on my list of things to read because I'm a fan of Martha Raditz's reporting. And she did a book called The Long Road Home. And The Long Road Home is about a specific event or series of events.
That is correct. It is set on April 4th, 2004, and basically tells the story of the ambush of a 19-man platoon of American soldiers who have just arrived in Iraq. It is day 4 for them when they're ambushed by 6,000 insurgents.
Oh, my God.
And these are all just regular, ordinary guys who have never been in combat before. And in the initial attack, 2 of their vehicles become disabled, and they have to seek shelter, basically in this maze-like city in the worst part of Baghdad, a slum called Sadr City. And we then follow in real time, both in Iraq and on the home front, the rescue operation that follows, also by guys who have just arrived. And one thing which makes the battle particularly challenging is that this is about 11 months after Bush's mission accomplished speech. So because the expectation was peacekeeping and rebuilding infrastructure, none of the normal heavy artillery or equipment was brought by the unit. So these are basically guys getting into unarmored Humvees, exposed trucks and riding in to try to save their brothers.
Wow. So what's happened is this story that you've just kind of outlined is now a series of television episodes.
Yes, it is an 8-hour miniseries which premieres simultaneously on National Geographic in 171 countries in 45 languages. I learned this week in India we premiere in 4 different languages.
Oh, neat.
Because of the...
What language is the best language for this, do you think?
I like the original English, though...
I gotta say Urdu. I gotta go Urdu on this.
I haven't heard that version yet, but...
So The Long Road Home will premiere on National Geographic and around the world, and it is November 7th. The story, from your standpoint, that is from a filmmaker's standpoint, you have to figure out, I suppose, how to tell this story, from the perspective of the guys who are in trouble, or how do you capture everything you've just described?
Well, one of the big challenges in the story is that, let me just first say that Martha's book is probably one of the most remarkable pieces of reporting that I had ever read in my life.
Now, Martha's an ABC News correspondent.
Yes, she's the chief global news correspondent for ABC News. And she basically heard about the story when she was in Iraq covering another assignment. And they asked, did you hear what happened to the 1st Cavalry? And she said no. And she was flown in to meet the guys and initially did a series of reports for Nightline. And she has followed now for more than 13 years. These guys, these families, stayed in touch with them. And she literally, at the time, no one knew how significant April 4th, 2004 would be historically. But she just cared about them and literally rescued all these people from being lost to history. So the biggest challenge in conceptualizing this for television is really there's probably 60 soldiers and families you get to know in Martha's book, which is somehow, I feel like when you're reading a book, it's easy to track. But I really wanted to, in some ways, reinvent what the war drama looks like for television. So I had this ambition that since the event takes 8 hours, they're pinned down for 8 hours until they're rescued.
Spoiler alert, they're rescued?
Well, I will say that the event is known as Black Sunday. So the price of that rescue is enormous, as you will see.
Okay.
And changes everyone who is in it for life.
Yeah, Mark.
But
it's not just like, oh, hey, everything's fine.
I couldn't skip just to the last
It's
episode.
not,
to see
it's
how
not
they
really
do.
a spoiler. It's not really. We don't really have to alert us.
So the one thought I had was, would it be possible for us to choose 8 main characters who would appear in each episode, but each hour we would shift the point of view to that character so that they become our sort of prism into the event. And mind you now, we're following the events in virtually real time, both in Iraq and on the home front, so we cut back and forth. So I also thought, would it be possible for us to also visit their pasts and get to really know who they are, so that unlike most war dramas that begin with, we're leaving home, we're in combat, we come back, this is not that show. We do quite interesting things.
That's brilliant.
In the first couple of episodes, we reset the clock. Like each episode ends on a big cliffhanger, and then the next episode begins, and we're back on the home front, and it's before. In the first 3 episodes, it's the night before, the day before. And then episode 4 suddenly plunges us, and it's 5 years before. Episode 5 switches our point of view to the Iraqi side, and almost half of that episode is in Arabic with English subtitles and tells the story of the platoon's interpreter. Episode 6 plunges us into the future of one of the characters, so it has quite the unusual structure.
Oh, wow.
Which I hope is going to give an intimacy to... I really wanted to do this focus, too, so that you get to really live through the day hour by hour with different families. So each of these backstories establishes what the different soldiers, different couples are struggling with, and how that gets sort of thematically reflected in the episode and in the lives of the other soldiers, too.
That's amazing.
Was that the way the book was set out or not?
The series does draw inspiration. The book is structured so it alternates between the war front and the home front, which is what really struck me. 2 things struck me. One was that, so many Hollywood stories are about elite troops and super soldiers and, on special forces missions. That's, again, not the story. This is about the everyman soldier, ordinary guys who, joined the army, for various reasons. And it really became, so the thing that struck me is that it really was the first time that you really got to feel what it's like to go to war for the first time as a soldier. And what's more, what Martha does so uniquely is that you get such an intimate portrait of each of these guys and their families. And I just, when I was reading it, just fell in love with that. And it is so heartbreaking and devastating. And one of the things that struck me, too, is that just how incredibly precious ordinary life is. All the things that war threatens with extinction, people's futures. One of the things that I find very haunting to think about still is, in our first episode, the main characters are Lieutenant Shane Aguero and his wife Amber. And he's this, young, kind of goofy guy who's a big Star Wars sci-fi nerd, which is, I naturally gravitated toward him as a main character because of that. And he tells the funniest war stories. They are, very life and death situations, but incredibly funny. And then he suddenly gets quiet, and you can see that something changes, that there's a lot that, on the surface, when you meet with a lot of veterans, they seem fine, but everyone's affected by PTSD. And I remember I had dinner with him and his wife once, and I showed this picture that's my favorite picture of him, which is taken on Cooper Field, which is the big sort of ceremonial field in Fort Hood where troops depart from. And he's holding a rifle with this kind of goofy grin, and it's filled with such innocence about where he's headed. And his wife, Amber, got really quiet, and I noticed that she looked really sad, and so I said, "What is it?" And she said, "Every time I look at that picture, I think my husband who's in that picture never came back." Yeah. And that, I think, is true for all the families in the story.
Yeah.
It's in a way so good to hear you say that, because I think we sanitize a lot of these war situations, and we glorify, of course, victory. And we have this sense of, I want to go kick some ass, and I want to go hunt out the terrorists and blow them up or whatever. And, of course, nothing is that simple. Nothing is that way. And the price of war is paid in so many different ways. And so when I saw that you were doing this series, I was really hoping for what you just described, which is sort of an unvarnished look at what can happen emotionally, physically, and the price of war while we follow the story.
Sure, and I think, again, going back to sort of most Hollywood portraits, I joke that the only thing you ever get to see soldiers do besides being combat is work out at the, forward operating base. And that's just not the experience of soldiers. Soldiers are homesick, they're unnerved, distressed from being away from their families for the first time. They have diarrhea, they have, the experience is very intense and personal for them even before combat ever begins.
Did you see there was there were so many documentaries, so I'll just throw one out, but Restrepo is...
Yes, excellent, yeah.
So you see, what Restrepo is sort of, it's a documentary, and it's just a camera rolling a lot of the time on stuff that's going on in this unit, which is called Restrepo. It was named for one of the guys who I believe was killed, a medic who was killed. But you, as Mikko has just said, you see the boredom, you see the way they keep themselves occupied, then you see the intense adrenaline rush and the life and death situations that they face in a moment, and then back to boredom or back to nothing. It's a weird aspect of seeing the war.
It's the worst possible situation a human could be in, I think, in the sense of like you're bored knowing you could be under attack at any minute. You never feel safe at any time. I mean, in a sense, you're always under attack, and sometimes you're literally actually being attacked.
But you can't sustain that level of alertness or readiness.
Unreal.
But I think what's different in this story, though, is that because it was expected to be a peacekeeping mission, it was Sadr City, Baghdad, was informally referred to as the safest place in Iraq. So there was, I think, the shock of suddenly being under fire from 6,000 insurgents when the unit has just arrived, and what we find out in our first episode is that they're just about to formally take over authority over Sadr City. And the enemy actually timed this attack specifically at 6 p.m. when they knew that it would cause maximum chaos. That's the moment when the outgoing unit disconnects their comms and the new unit reconnects theirs. So one platoon was out at this point escorting sanitation trucks. And there have been some sort of weird incidents earlier in the day, but nothing overt that would show, certainly no breakout of massive hostilities. But because they were out of the base, their GPS trackers had not been connected to Camp War Eagle, which was their forward operating base. So when they got pinned down, they had no way of saying where they are in this maze. Sadr City was built as a kind of grid where 2.5 million people live there. And it was impossible for them to say exactly where they were. And they're under fire from every direction. So there were unique challenges to this, and I think a unique shock that went through everyone because you were expecting to mostly just have to cope with the smell of raw sewage, and suddenly you're under fire.
And I want to make a distinction. I was just mentioning Restrepo as a kind of a face of war because we were talking about war and sort of real life of war. This is just the opposite. There's no real boredom here. This is a rescue operation, a sudden, intense attack. Although, as I'm learning now, you tell it from so many different perspectives.
Yeah, it was very important to me that we also showed the home front because not just I found the personal stories of each of the characters and what they were struggling with as couples due to the separation to be incredibly compelling.
And these are real people.
Yeah, real people. And we also use everyone's real name. There's only 2 characters that we composited and renamed only because the resulting character didn't sufficiently resemble the person that they were based on to call them that. But every other person in the story gave us permission to use their real name. So beyond the personal stories being incredibly interesting, what was unique about this day, too, is that this was a Sunday morning in the United States. And around noon, news first starts to trickle to the United States that something has happened in Sadr City, and CNN actually breaks the story before the Army ever has a chance to notify anyone in Fort Hood even that an attack has taken place, because what happens in those situations is that the forward operating base goes into a communications blackout so that people can't call out and accidentally relay wrong information. It's a security measure. But CNN has learned that by this point, 4 American soldiers are dead, at least 24 are wounded, and the unit is pinned down. So you can imagine in Fort Hood, when the news breaks, there's absolute chaos. People want to have answers. And one of the things that we look at is there is a organization called the Family Readiness Group, which I don't know if you guys have ever heard of. I had never heard of it until I read Martha's book. But it's basically a volunteer organization by the women that's meant to be there to care for families in crisis, usually, anything from divorce to drug addiction to a death in the family. And they are told some things, like as soon as information starts to come in so that the care teams can prepare, they're told maybe the casualties below this rank, but they're not permitted to share any of that information until the Army has a chance to locate the next of kin of all the soldiers who have been killed and tell them. So in real life, this actually goes on for days. No one has any idea if their spouses are okay or not, and there's fear and chaos and enormous tension. So I really wanted to imagine, we all struggle with separation from our spouses, but imagine you're separated for a year and your spouse is potentially in mortal danger during that time, to really convey what that experience is like for people. And it was fascinating to me how different couples cope with that. Some had this almost fatalistic attitude that what's going to happen is going to happen, and I'm not going to worry about it until it does. And others will be glued to the TV, sort of nervously watching for any kind of news story, and obviously your heart starts to pound when you hear something's happened in Iraq. And I think we talk a lot about our military families and sacrifice and bravery, but I will say that until you start to really hear individual stories, you really don't understand what it's like. One of the veterans mentioned to me that he was in the Army for 9 years and then retired. And he said, I realized when I got home, I've been married to my wife for 9 years, but I've actually kind of known her for 4 years, because that's the amount of time I've actually spent with her physically. So the sacrifices that these couples make is incredible, and I hope that the series will impart an understanding to audiences what they go through.
That's awesome.
It's clearly more of a global sense you get of everybody involved in this thing, as opposed to a story about, like, Black Hawk Down, for example, was all about, getting those guys out and those guys shooting back. And as I recall, I can't remember any part of Black Hawk Down that, wasn't related to, shooting your way out, then the Rangers coming in and getting the guys out or whatever it was.
Yeah, I think there's always a challenge, I think. What I mostly remember about Black Hawk Down is how terrifying it is as an experience.
Right.
But if you had asked me to sit down afterwards and said, please name all the characters and who they were, you would be hard-pressed, I think, to... Yeah. You would know that, yes, I remember Orlando Bloom was in it and Josh Hartnett and all these different actors, even though many of them weren't famous stars, but you might remember their faces. And that is a challenge when you make a film where, especially when it unfolds in real time, everyone's wearing a helmet and Kevlar. And I remember at some point, one of my executive producers said, maybe we should do something to the helmets. Maybe we should, alter them or do like a Full Metal Jacket type of thing. And I just said, if we have to do that, we've lost the audience. We have to get to know them as characters. And so the other fascinating challenge is, how do you orient the audience? You obviously want to choose. I wanted to choose soldiers where the point of view already would orient the audience. We have the top commander at Camp War Eagle as a main character. We have the lieutenant who is pinned down, the young captain played by Jason Ritter, who leads the first rescue convoy into the city. We have one of the squad leaders in the pinned down platoon. We have two guys in the very last truck of the very last convoy. And it was also very important to me that we didn't just tell the stories of the commanders and the survivors, and frankly, the white soldiers, because so many Hollywood stories are like that too. I really wanted us to get to know, because half of one of the rescue convoys, more than half, was soldiers of color, that we really get a diverse cast. And I will say that National Geographic, they were such amazing partners. I feel like they had all the same essential values. The other thing, my big issue with, my big criticism really of Black Hawk Down is that you never get to meet a single recognizable human being on the other side. And I was very determined that our story would also tell the Iraqi perspective into the event, and we would get to know real people on that side. One of the things when I read the book was that it struck me, so Sadr City was all Shia, and Iraq is a unique place in the Arab world where the Shia are actually the majority. About 2/3 of the country is Shia. But they had suffered uniquely under Saddam Hussein, who hated them, and Sadr City was almost a ghetto in which they had been forced. So I started thinking, when I'm reading the book, is of all places in Iraq, why would the people of Sadr City rise up against the Americans? What was that about? And when you start looking into it, you discover a couple of things. One is that after the first Gulf War, the United States left Saddam Hussein in power, but then encouraged the Shia to rebel. There was that famous speech by President Bush saying maybe the Iraqis could take matters into their own hands. So they did. But then the United States did not support the uprising militarily, and it resulted in a shocking wave of repression and arrests and torture and killings. So that was something that certainly many held the Americans responsible for. And I do think that we tend to think of war and all these things as a global conflict thing, but they're all intensely personal experiences, and that is also true for Muqtada al-Sadr, who was the Shia cleric who basically formed the militia that led this uprising. His father and brother had been killed by Saddam Hussein, and he held the Americans responsible for that. The other thing that happened was when the United States invaded in 2003, they disbanded the Iraqi military, which resulted in chaos and lawlessness, especially in Sadr City. So there was an enormous amount of building resentment that the incoming soldiers obviously knew nothing about. But one of the things I really wanted to show from the Iraqi side is Sadr City had 2.5 million people. Only the best estimates on the size of the militia forces was 6,000. So the absolute vast majority was innocent, just regular civilians who all they were trying to do was survive, kind of like our soldiers in this story. They were trapped in circumstances not of their making. And I really wanted in our both story of the interpreter and the soldiers become trapped inside a house with an Iraqi family to really give full portraits of all of them and show the divided views that people had into the occupation and the presence of the Americans, but also that Islam shares the same essential core values as does Judaism and Christianity, that there is a prohibition against killing women and children and an obligation to protect the vulnerable and innocent in conflict. Because I feel like all too often a lot of contemporary thrillers and war stories involve, Muslims on the other side. And I didn't want this to be that story where we just have a lot of militia members dressed in black, firing AKs, being that's sort of the Iraqi side of the story.
How did you communicate that the Muslim faith has these values that you described?
So one of the things that we tell, I wanted to layer the story with a couple of mysteries that you sort of follow in the course of all of this. And you find out, was a famous adage in Sadr City that every single house was permitted an AK for self-defense. That was true. Wow. And so when the soldiers come in, there's no weapon that they can find, and some of the soldiers are suspicious about that. So you learn, the soldiers don't know this because they don't speak Arabic, but we as the audience sometimes have more knowledge of the family. We know something has happened to this family before. Soldiers have come to their house before. And the mother says a couple of things about it, including, you've seen what despair can do. And as the story progresses, and I don't want to give it away, we do, and this was one of those things where I feel like I was so lucky to have National Geographic as a partner when I said, I want the father to tell his story in full and have our interpreter translate it for the soldiers. And it's a long scene. It's almost 5 minutes long. And it's literally those two guys talking and the soldiers listening who are in the room. And the fact that they said that sounds in the middle of this otherwise often incredibly intense show, I have heard from some reviewers already that they think it is one of the extraordinary moments in the entire series because it's completely unexpected. But that's one way that we talk about.
Don't you think if you get the right actor for that, the right person telling that story, even in Arabic, that could be a riveting sequence?
I will say we had the most extraordinary cast for this show. Shooting in Texas, we were there for 4 months. We lived in Fort Hood in military housing.
Oh, wow.
And I will say that it was... when I got there, I'm from Finland, so I'm easily hot when it's warm.
Oh, what a great place for you!
And when we
say that on your business card, yeah.
I'm easily hot.
So when we get to Texas, it's I moved there in very early March, and it's still getting to be hot. It's like 85 degrees and humid. And I keep saying,
Laura's from Texas.
Oh yeah, I know exactly.
Your reaction is kind of
March is fine.
We have our crew is mostly Austin based.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, it gets to be almost 90 degrees some days, and humid. I said, God, it's hot, and people give me these kind of smiles. I'm like, what are you smiling about? What don't I know? What I don't know that it's going to be
chilly.
106.
Yeah, easy.
And we have snakes in the catering tent, and we have tarantulas, and we have red wasps coming out of walls. And when you have, I used to joke at night, we had a significant amount of night shooting, and when you would turn on the lights, the beams will be covered in bugs. And I said, the only thing I can describe this with is the phrase from Game of Thrones, the night is dark and full of terrors. And I say all of that to as a prelude to saying that our cast was so incredibly committed and tireless and never complained. Aww. And I had the opportunity often to be, if I elected to, in an air-conditioned video village when they were in full helmets and Kevlar and uniforms. I did wear long pants every day in solidarity with the cast. Wow. Because I felt like that.
I wouldn't have.
I wouldn't be. I'd be so in air conditioning.
Yeah.
The cast wouldn't even know who the
You know what?
was.
You wanted to be an actor, I'd say. Because you chose this.
Yeah, listen, I'm not going to be on Jimmy Kimmel's show like you guys are.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to do Mark Thompson's show.
Yeah.
Okay? And I'm going to be sitting back in the air conditioning.
No, that is amazing. It's growing up in Texas, like you're told as a kid at summer camp, it's like, look in your shoes before you put them on because there will be a scorpion inside. Like in the board. Like now, it just occurred to me, like that's a intense thing to tell an 8-year-old, but that's a normal Texas.
I distinctly remember a briefing one day.
There's going to be a scorpion in your shoe.
From our first AD, when he said, just for everyone to be aware, today is the official start of the mating season for scorpions and black widows and some other type of spider. And I remember thinking, of course it is. Yeah. What else would it be?
So if you were there March, April, May, June, you missed August. Which is...
we narrowly missed August,
No,
yes.
that is it's a hellscape.
I also learned about something called chiggers.
Oh, yeah.
Which when people say, oh, no, don't lie down in the grass. I'm like, why? There's chiggers. And I'm like, of course there is. Why?
Yeah.
I don't even know what they are, but I know they're bad.
It's like a grass flea.
Well, I thought a chigger can actually like burrow into your skin.
Yeah, correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And we had that happen to some people who did not get the memo.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So when you say it's an 8-part miniseries, that's like an 8-hour movie, right?
That's essentially it, yes.
That's a lot. I don't even know how that process begins. Do you beat out a bunch of story and then you turn that into script? Or just give us a shorthand for how that process works.
Well, this one was a little bit unique, just to give you the background of how I became involved. So Mike Medavoy, who I did the 33 with.
Yeah, the 33 was the movie about the Chilean miners.
Yes.
Right.
So Mike and I have known each other for a long time, and Mike first sent me the book 9 years ago. We had done a pilot at NBC together, and Mike knew that I was really drawn to real-life stories and meaningful stories. And we initially developed it as a 3-hour feature. And it was one of those things where everyone who read the script said, oh, my God, this is the most amazing, beautiful story. So that means you want to finance it? No. It was because it was an Iraq war story at a time when that was very unpopular. And we tried every year. We got directors interested, we get financing, but then it was an Iraq war story. And it was in 2014 when it was the 10th anniversary. I really started lamenting. I said, if we can't get it done this year, then when are we ever going to do it? And that's when we started thinking about it. Maybe we should consider television, because television, the following year, it became clear that television was really entering, I think, the 70s was the sort of golden age of American cinema, which I love and Mike loves. And Mike obviously had a hand in some of the most iconic films ever made, from Apocalypse Now to Annie Hall to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And we had been lamenting where the movie side of the industry was headed. So then we really started thinking about, like, could this be an 8-hour miniseries? And because I had given a significant amount of thought already on how to organize the information and which points of view to choose, and we had to leave out some people simply because 3 hours is it really isn't enough to tell this story fully. I wrote a pitch, which was supposed to be like 20 minutes, and took about an hour and 15 minutes, which is in Hollywood an absolute eternity, that if you told people that ahead of time, they would just not even want to hear you. But it was also very riveting because you really got to know the people intimately, and it was a very kind of a 35,000-foot view into the event itself. It was much more about the characters and who they become and what their backstories are. And I actually had to pitch it over the phone to National Geographic because they were at the time based in D.C., and it was like an 8:30 a.m. pitch. And I was like, this is never going to work, because there was a deck and a chart that kind of showed you how the story flowed. And I was like, this doesn't work if you're not in the room. Who's going to look at their computer and listen to me babbling over the phone? You guys are like, we know about your babbling. But they literally said yes right after hearing it. They saw the potential for it. And so,
wow, because I'm with you. Like, people are still getting settled at 8:30 in the morning. They got to go through this now. They're wading through all these characters.
Yeah, they hit mute. They go to the bathroom and then go back and try to catch up on what the pitch is about.
But it sounds like in such a great way with your story is like you have this story and literally platform technology became ready to be the place for you to tell your story. Like when you started with the story, it was like, oh, I guess it's a movie in a theater. It's a movie. And then like, no. And it's like, to me,
the technology caught up with you.
Enough time had passed where people loved binge watching, and Orange is the New Black, and people want things on Hulu, and now other channels are doing more interesting things, and then Nat Geo is true. Like, now we want to make something.
Yeah, in a way, the delay might have helped you.
This is the story.
I do
for
think
us.
that this was the way it was meant to be told.
Yeah, they were
I
waiting
really
for you. Like they
and Nat
were
Geo
waiting
also
for that story.
has a very interesting approach to programming, because they are such an iconic brand, and a lot of what they do is still nonfiction, and the network's vision for their scripted programming is really rooted in authenticity. They're not going to ever become a fully scripted network. We are the second ever scripted show they have done. The first one was Genius, about Albert Einstein. So
heard of him?
It was, and they were so extraordinarily supportive about everything that we want to do. But now, to finally answer your question on how did that work from there. So they originally commissioned a series Bible and a pilot script, and I took probably about 2 months to write the Bible, and it was an incredibly detailed, and for some reason, I think because I'd lived with the story for such a long time, and I really had been so invested in telling it for these families. It was a very unusual series Bible. There's a long preamble that talks really about the shock of being in combat for the first time, kind of an abstract introduction, and what is it like to say goodbye to your families in the field. Then it introduces all the characters and give you a kind of a summary of this is their arc in the story with pictures of the real life people and who their families are and what they're struggling with. That's followed by a page-and-a-half summary of each of the episodes that kind of goes through it actually beat by beat. So it gives you the major arcs and cliffhangers and things like that. And then after the last episode, I just felt like I hope it's incredibly compelling, but I want to return to why this story, why it's important. So the last page is just a date and a place and tells the story of my first meeting with the family of Specialist Robert Arciaga, who was one of the soldiers who was killed in this battle, and talking to his mom, Sylvia, about why I wanted to tell the story and why I wanted to tell Robert's story. And she mentioned to me that it was a few weeks after Robert was killed, USA Today did this big cover story that was called The Deadliest Month in Iraq. Wow. And Robert's picture was one of the soldiers. That was the front page was simply photos of the fallen. And she said, in the immediate wake of that, there was such caring and attention to all the families of the soldiers that then faded away. And she said one of her great fears was always that no one would ever remember that this ever happened. And she said, she has lost 2 sons to war. In addition to Robert, her son Jeremy, who was a Marine, committed suicide from PTSD actually 2 months before we met. And obviously that has shaken her a lot, and she has a lot of difficulty in accepting that and criticism of the way that the VA treats soldiers with PTSD. And we have a big awareness campaign that accompanies the series about PTSD. But she said she could accept that she lost Robert because he died in trying to save others. But I felt, much as Martha, I think, just a duty to tell the stories of these soldiers and families so they wouldn't be forgotten. And I think one of the things that people may not be aware of in the larger context is the first time I went to Fort Hood and I visited the memorial that is in Cooper Field, where the troops depart from, and it's to the division's entire deployment in Iraq. And the first names on the memorial are the guys in our story. And the memorial kind of resembles the Vietnam War Memorial, not as big, but it's black granite and names are carved into it. And I remember thinking, there's so many names. You walk around, this is just this one division, and you look at it, and there's dates, and you can see groupings of when a lot of guys fell in battle, and you can almost, in the abstract, see the ebb and flow of combat. But I remember thinking, behind every single name on this wall, on every war memorial in every country, is a story that's just as important, just as moving, just as heartbreaking as the one that we're telling. And no one will ever know those stories, which is why I think this one and any real-life war story that's told deserves our attention.
That's so well said, that
That's amazing.
You wish there was a way to memorialize all the stories of all those names, of all those people, all those lives that were lost one way or another. And we always talk about support the troops. I support the troops. Don't disrespect the troops. Don't you show your patriotism with the troops. We do a lot of cosmetic things in this country. I'm not going to turn this into a political thing or down on the country in any way. But I guess it's more to the point that the ceremonial patriotism is a lot of what we do. And probably it's a lot of what many cultures do. But when you actually get into the storytelling that helps you appreciate the depth of who these people were and who they are and what they experienced, I just think that's a whole other level of appreciation. And so you're saying that those families that went through this were actually grateful because their stories were fading. The memories of what had happened in the public consciousness I'm talking about, their memories were fading.
I hope that it will be healing for them to know that the world is going to know their stories. I don't know how they're going to be emotionally able to bear some of the content, because it is a pretty unflinching portrait of, as I said, we want to tell in the most authentic way what war is really like. There's one thing that a lot of the soldiers touched on is what the act of killing is like. And one of them, Carl Wilde, said to me that it changes you, even though it happens in war and you can say, I did it to defend my life, I had no choice, the person was the enemy, I had every right to do that. It changes you, and anyone who says it doesn't is lying. And you can see the enormous toll that takes on our soldiers and then consequently on our families. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of patriotic gestures, sorry to politicize and say empty patriotism, because if we really cared about our troops, it would be considered a national emergency that so many soldiers commit suicide or that so many veterans are homeless. That is a much more important thing to call attention to than to debate people kneeling during football games.
I also think, and this I really just think, like I need some independent perspective on this. I think that war changes people. And even if you're not in a fighting situation, you're now alongside black, white, Latino, gay, straight, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, the way you view these people in that community is different because that crucible of having to defend yourself or having to protect your unit or whatever it may be, I would think that that would change the way you view the world.
For sure. So we had 2 Army Rangers and 2 veterans of this battle train our actors. And I remember on their first day, they went through a 2-week boot camp. And Mike Baumgarten, who was the senior trainer, who's actually a quite young guy, but served 10 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Jeez.
He asked, one of the first things he asked the actors was, how many people do you know who would take a bullet for you? And not a single person in the room could say, oh, I know someone. And he said, I know at least 30 guys. And that's an extraordinary statement, and that I think speaks to how when you serve in a unit with people all different colors and creeds, you do have a different perspective because you see they're your brother. They would take a bullet for you.
What are the movies that you, or I think of them mostly as movies or documentaries that you feel, well, those are really great war movies, or they help kind of maybe inform a bit of how I looked at a good way to do this movie that I'm working on. This is a miniseries, but as we said, it's an 8-hour movie.
I'll give you 2 completely contradictory, and one of them is going to sound completely bizarre as a reference. So the first one, I'll give you the logical one first, is a film called 71 by Jan de Mange, which is a great war film about the troubles in Northern Ireland and a soldier who gets trapped behind enemy lines and has to survive the night. And it's shot in this very realistic, almost handheld style. And I was just so struck by the immediacy and intimacy of what that experience was like. And that's how I wanted to approach, sort of looks-wise, what the show would feel like. The other film is the Meryl Streep, Julianne Moore, Nicole Kidman film, The Hours. And you're going to go, why?
I get it.
Because one of the theses of that film is that is it possible in the course of one day to understand the entire life of a person? That was my approach to the structure, that you would really understand who everyone was, who they would become in the course of this. So you choose perspectives of people who may come to Iraq cynical. This just went to, I was going to mention this earlier. I think we sometimes tend to think of all soldiers have the same point of view, or they're all idealistic, or no one is ever cynical. One of the soldiers told me, yeah, I knew that, the reasons for the war were bullshit, and, Halliburton sucks and all these different things. So there is a whole diversity of opinion, but I was intrigued by, depending on what perspective people came to the war from, what happened to them, who was idealistic and had that destroyed. I do want to say that we can be cynical about the reasons for the Iraq war, but the soldiers who served there had nothing to do with that. Our soldiers go where the government sends them, which is why it's our responsibility to elect leaders who act responsibly and don't just send soldiers to war.
I think we learned that in Vietnam, and I still think this nation has a shame about the way it treated people coming back from Vietnam.
Yeah, but we don't treat them any differently.
No, but
I don't think this nation has any shame about it.
Well, okay, let me make the. By the way, I agree completely with everything you've said before, and I know that's kind of what you're referring to. About
super anti-American.
There's no support.
You can tweet at me.
No, there's no support for PTSD, for the mental health, all the rest. But it was even worse, if you can imagine, those guys coming back from Vietnam. And here's what I mean. They were spit on. They had stuff thrown at them. They were jeered. You have no idea. If you didn't live through the return of those Vietnam vets, you literally have no idea how awful it was. They did what Mikko was just talking about. They associated those poor soldiers. And by the way, they didn't volunteer. That was a draft. No one wanted to go. They knew it was a death sentence. 45,000 guys died over there. Anyway, what I'm just saying is we have evolved past that. We've now been able to separate, okay, we know that they're just sent there by a bunch of other people. But as Laura's had now referenced a couple times.
Now we just insist that they become homeless.
Right, we just let them down in many ways.
It's amazing.
Mark, I will say that I completely agree with you, and I think what happens is that our returning veterans become invisible. I'll tell you, one of the soldiers, I was interviewing him, and it's a remarkable thing to be able to talk to people over the course of 10 years almost. about how their life changed and people leave the military. And one soldier who I met recently, I knew his story from before, but he had since left the military, and asked, so what are you doing now? And he said, well, as it turns out, I have no skills. And it's outrageous to me that all these guys who have learned to survive in the most impossible circumstances, who have real leadership skills, are incredibly loyal, are told, you have to start from scratch. And that's why, and homeless, this is an absolute disgrace. The fact that we have a single veteran who is homeless in this country is outrageous.
And there have been movements to create housing for veterans, but it doesn't make anybody money, so it doesn't go through.
But Los Angeles has really taken leadership in this, because we are taking some of these decrepit, dilapidated motels that are being basically torn down and rebuilt as free housing for veterans.
Yeah,
and every city should do that.
That was the idea. Which is why I take a hyperbolic point of view on it, because I don't have the energy to speak about it thoughtfully. Because it's so thoughtless to me that that is why I will drop verbal bombs of just being like, this is gross.
It's a disgrace. It's absolutely a
awful.
disgrace. I think you're right to call it out.
And that's why it is, because when you were talking about the hours, when you were first talking about the structure of how you do it, I thought of specifically Orange is the New Black, of like, your story is taking place, and you know this one girl's story, and then everybody in the prison is, oh, you're just a crazy prison. Oh, people are one-dimensional until you know their backstory. Like I'm in recovery, and part of what we do is tell our stories, because you look around and you go, I don't know these people, I don't care, I don't want to know anything about it. And then somebody shares for 3 minutes and you go, oh my God, I love him. I love her. Oh my God. And it's the same in like Orange is this is the crazy chick with the crush on her that pees on the thing. And they show a 3-minute backstory and you go, oh my God, what you've been through. Oh, look at who you are outside of this place, who you were. And that is like,
that's exactly what Mikko's film does. That's exactly what your miniseries does.
No,
it does it over and over.
That's
your
exactly
point.
what I was thinking. And like also in Hurt Locker, like I thought of Hurt Locker versus Black Hawk Down. I have no memory of anything other than shouting, dark, like special effects.
That is,
from
I mean,
Black
that's
Hawk
the other
Down.
that's the other challenge in the story, is that you have to find the ebb and flow of the story so that you allow these soldiers time away from being under fire, so you get to know who they are. So we tried to structure the show in such a way that everyone gets to have their moment where you understand who they are, but at the same time, everything that you see before and after already reflects that. You just don't know the full backstory. But I think it's always, in any film or movie, any film or TV show, when you're surprised by who people really are versus, how they first appear. That's always
It's kind of a cool idea that we're going to experience both the before, the during, and the after a little bit in your...
And I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but one of the, besides the interesting challenge that this all takes place on a Sunday afternoon into night and morning into night in the United States, I thought a lot about how do I want to end this so that it's true to the story and true to the experience of all the real life people. And so many war stories, again, they end with homecomings and who people become, who they are now. And that's not how this story ends, because that wasn't the reality for these families. This was day 4. And people don't get to come back, right? What happens after this to them is the rest of the deployment. And that was always one of the most striking things. How do you cope with that, as a family, knowing when you thought this was going to be peacekeeping and now everything has changed with the rest of the year? One of the things I should mention about April 4th, just to put it into the historical context of the war, which is why I think this story, beyond the incredible real-life people that it talks about, what I think National Geographic was drawn to, is that with the benefit of time, we can now see this is literally the day that the insurgency begins in southern Iraq. And from that will come basically the collapse of the Iraqi state, the birth of ISIS. So it's a huge sort of fracture point in history. Casey Sheehan, Cindy Sheehan's son, is one of the soldiers killed in this battle. So she single-handedly begins sort of the modern anti-war movement, you could say. Thomas Young, who Noel Fisher plays in the show, who you may know from the famous documentary Body of War, he's paralyzed in this battle and becomes a part of the anti-war movement. So there are all these amazing threads of history that converge, but at the same time, that is the background to what is really a study about, men and women at war.
Wow. That really does set up an enormous context for this and its effects just on the national dialogue and awareness. So, again, it's The Long Road Home. April 4th, 2004 is when it all happened. And it all happened in Sadr City. Sadr City is like a small part of Baghdad.
That's right, yeah.
And the fact that it was supposed to be a peacekeeping mission, I had no idea. So these guys really have nothing with them.
I mean, they have weapons.
But they're not in armored vehicles, per se.
Well, the two of the Humvees are basically up-armored, so the two vehicles that survived the initial ambush survived because they were armored. But, for example, there is a Bradley troop transport vehicle that a lot of people, when they see it, go, oh, that's a tank, until you see a tank. And then you're like, oh, that is a Bradley.
No, that's a tank.
I still smile now because having on a military base, when people say, that's such a cool picture of that tank, and it's like, that isn't a tank, that's a Bradley. But so there are, the thing that struck me the first time I visited Fort Hood is that I entered through one of the smaller gates. So you really feel like you are arriving in a, not quite Pleasantville or a small college town, but that kind of place, until you cross the street and suddenly there's miles of hundreds of fighting vehicles and tanks and Bradleys, and it's a completely different world. So this unit had initially 4 Bradleys that they could take to combat with them, and the rest was mostly unarmored trucks, and that all changed obviously in the aftermath of this. But that is how secure people thought the place was.
Yeah. It was known as Black Sunday, this attack,
yeah.
And it's all memorialized in The Long Road Home. November 7th, if you're listening to this and it's after November 7th, you can still find all the information, and I think you can stream it on National Geographic.
Geo.
Yeah, and we begin with a 2-hour premiere, and then every Tuesday at 10 p.m. until December 19th. And I do think the episodes will be ready to stream. I believe they encore the previous week's episode right before the new one. So you can, if you miss it one week, you can catch up the following.
I can't wait. I mean, it sounds really cool. I mean, and the way you've approached it artistically and also honoring, because these are real people, their stories, sounds awesome. So,
Yeah.
Should I tell you who's in it?
Except Jason Ritter, which is amazing.
So Michael Kelly, Jason Ritter, Kate Bosworth, E.J. Bonilla, who plays Shane Aguero, Noel Fisher, Darius Hamanyoun is the actor who plays our interpreter, John Beavers, who's just an extraordinary actor, Ian Quinlan, Jorge Diaz, and Patrick Schwarzenegger.
Oh, that's cool.
In one of his first bigger roles.
Do you have to write stuff in the moment ever in these situations, or is everything pretty well set to the page and it's the way you had done it before?
I
feel way you'd written it.
In this particular case, it was more production necessities required some rewriting, because we built what was at the time the largest set in North America that operated.
Wow.
And I should tell you, this is actually a unique aspect to the show. I had always wanted to shoot in Fort Hood, in the actual family homes, in the actual family readiness center, chapels, because it's just such a fascinating world. But I remember when I was so struck visually and by the energy of it. But we knew we couldn't film in Sadr City. We couldn't take our cast there. We couldn't take army vehicles or stage battles. So we had to build Sadr City. So the idea came, well, could we stage it in Fort Hood, where we would have all the equipment and the vehicles? And as it happens, we built our set of Sadr City on the training site where the very troops that this story is about originally trained. And we built 80 buildings to create the main avenue in Sadr City that the Americans called Route Delta, and the alley where our platoon finds the house that they're find refuge in.
What's involved in getting clearance to do that? I mean,
it was a lengthy negotiation with the Army, because we needed the Army's permission to film in Fort Hood. But the base itself and all the commanders were instantly receptive. They were, it's a very personal story for them, and they wanted to do everything they could to help us. And
so, what was the negotiation over?
It's mainly just
money.
You have to take less about that, and it's more the Army has other uses for the training site, mainly training soldiers for deployment. So to say you need to shut it down for 6 months and let us film there.
Maybe you didn't know what we're doing here, but we're training on
it's
that
always
training.
like we have other...
Well, we're making a movie.
So, we had... So anyway, but let me just finish this, and I'll tell you a funny story about that. Sorry. So we built 80 structures, refacaded about 35 others, and then built a separate forward operating base. And so we took over that whole area. And that's also where actors trained. But it is fascinating with the Army because it's a very bureaucratic institution, and when you need to change something or request something, we joked you need 6 forms in triplicate filed 6 weeks ahead of time. And when you are dealing with the realities of television production, things like rain, where you have to change to your rain cover plan and you don't know until the day before, and you have requests like, so I know we said we were filming this with this number of vehicles. We actually need to shut down the only road that can support the weight of tanks that leads from the training area back to the cantonment area, where people live and where all the offices are. That's the sort of super secure area of Fort Hood. And that's the only way in. We need to shut it down for 12 hours tomorrow, starting at 4 a.m. And Mary Middlestead, who was our military liaison, she always made the impossible happen. That's how committed they were in Fort Hood. She would just, and then we'd say, actually, it's not raining. We're going back to plan A. And the third time when we asked that, she said, okay, tomorrow you have to shoot. You have to shoot. Because 16 people need to sign off on it, and I can't ask a fourth time. Yeah. It did not rain that day, but we did shoot there anyway. But that was a really unique, amazing experience. I feel like we were so welcome in Fort Hood, and we all lived among soldiers. I always thought when we said we would live in military housing that they would block off a section and give it to us because one division was deployed, so there was a lot of room on base. But as it happened, we were just scattered all over these 2 housing areas and lived next door to soldiers. So every day you were reminded where you were and who you were doing this for.
In the morning, did you muster? I've always wanted to muster. Isn't that what they do when they get together in the morning?
What are you talking about?
There's physical training exercises that start, I want to say, around 6 a.m. So when you would drive to set, you would see basically the entire base was doing PT. And let
me tell you, it disappoints me that you two don't know what muster is.
I don't know what muster is.
All right, let me just tell you what muster is. Muster is what you do. You get together in the morning usually, like they play Reveille or whatever, and then you get muster from everywhere, and that's when you're all together. Right before you go to battle, you muster.
You still have not described what it is.
It's an assembly of people.
Muster.
It's another word for assembling, gathering.
It means gather.
Yeah. I don't know if they think. I suppose they do. I mean, one thing which is interesting that I did.
Is that an old reference?
You
Mark,
literally
they don't muster anymore, Mark.
You just kept saying muster.
That was the Korean War.
They like to do assemble before they do physical exercise, but they do play Reveille. That is true.
They do.
Yes.
I think I may have. I'll look it up. I may go back to the Revolutionary War.
The Crimean War.
Exactly.
No idea.
I love that you ran the steeplechase through the military of making this thing happen, because it was really not easy.
I will tell you, I did learn a lot, and I'm very aware now when I watch other military dramas. I suppose I've become one of those guys. I remember I watched War for the Planet of the Apes, which was not done with Army cooperation and did not have technical advisors who cared about certain details. So I remember watching it going like, these guys are outside without any headgear on. Wrong.
But they are fighting apes who talk.
They are on the radio and nobody says over when they finish a call. Wrong.
Oh, over. They actually still use over?
Yes, because you have to indicate that you're done speaking. And,
sure, they go.
I learned everything about who says out once you actually finish the call. It's
that's
and
cool.
We follow. And I will say, as much as, a lot of notes that say, okay, we need to add overs and all these things to make it correct, it does actually add a great layer of authenticity that you don't realize that's missing until you see something that you just go, well, for expediency or for whatever reason. I mean, you don't hear over every single time. I did do strategic cuts in scenes so that to limit that. But whenever there is a radio protocol is always followed in this show.
When we had walkie-talkies back in my neighborhood, that was a real breakthrough. And when I was talking on the walkie-talkie, I'd always use over. I'm heading back to the house for dinner, over.
You were also trying to get everybody to muster.
I was trying to get the muster.
You had a lot of old-timey things you were trying to
I did. I really
live through.
From a different age. I'm excited about seeing this.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
And if I may say one last thing, which is third movie that I did draw inspiration from, I think philosophically.
Friday the 13th. What?
Dead Man Walking. Do you remember the Tim Robbins film with Sean Penn and Susan Sarandon? I remember when I saw that.
Jack Black is in it also.
I remember when I saw that with friends. I have my passionate opinions about the death penalty that we can discuss at the next visit.
I'm guessing you're against it.
But not philosophically, only because I feel that it is applied unfairly by a justice system that applies it disproportionately to
poor people, brown people.
And I have friends who just philosophically, passionately agree with the death penalty. All of us, when we saw the film, felt that it spoke to our point of view about the issue. And I felt that I wanted, whether people were passionate opponents of the Iraq War or supported the war, they would all want to see this, because at its heart, this is really about our soldiers. And we will get both points of view into the conflict as well. But it really is, at its heart, about the people who we send in harm's way and their families.
The show is The Long Road Home. And Mikko Alanne, the creator of the show, coming up on Nat Geo. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Bye, everybody.
If you like The Edge, help us out by liking us on Facebook. Subscribe to The Edge with Mark Thompson on iTunes or on Stitcher.
Edge-show.com.
Edge-show.com.
Hey, everybody, why don't you do me a favor and like The Edge with Mark Thompson on Facebook? Yeah, that's going to bring in the kids.